So this is the final session of this year. We prepared 10 sessions for this academic year, and we're ending with the climate and ecological crisis, which this year we prepared 10 sessions. Sorry, that's my YouTube. Um, yeah. we're talking about this very like salient topic of the climate and ecological crisis, and also we want to end with a really like deep thinking of like what can the workers do, like what's the role of the working class movement and the trade union movement in trying to challenge the climate crisis. um yeah. And as usual, I'd like to promote quickly that the GFTU, in partnership with SOAS Economics Department, has launched a survey for all workers in Britain and Ireland to hear about your experiences about trade unions in general and union education, and what topics of political economy you might be interested in. You don't have to be a union member to take this survey. It's open to all workers in Britain and Ireland, regardless of union membership, nationality, immigration status, or even the employment status. So if you're currently out of work, that doesn't matter. I'll type in the link in the chat. And as usual, the questions, you can ask the questions throughout the session. You don't have to wait until the second half to ask the question, but please use the Q&A box in the bottom to ask the question so that we can keep track rather than the chat box if it's a question for the speakers. I think that is everything from me, and I will. Sorry, I'm very bad at multitasking. I can only do one thing at at a time. So I will type in the link to the survey and introduce Ying, today's chair, and hand over the floor to Ying. So Ying Chen is Associate Professor of Economics at the New School, and she holds a PhD in economics from University of Massachusetts Amherst. Her work explores the contradictions within capitalism and how they exhibit themselves. Topics she has studied include economic development, labor, and climate change, with a special focus on the global south. So, Ying, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Honey, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. So as Honey mentioned, I teach economics at the New School for Social Research in New York, and I'm also an active organizer and participant of the SAPE lecture series. And I'm very honored to be able to host this webinar, joined by two renowned scholars, Max Ill and John Bellamy Foster, whose scholarship I draw on significantly in my own teaching and research. I think both scholars have made really important contributions to the critical debates on ecology from the political economy perspective, and particularly on its relation with capitalism. So I think their works have significantly shaped how we understand the roots of today's climate crisis and the possibility for alternative futures. So let me say a few words about the topic before turning to our speakers today. Um, in today's world, climate and ecological crisis is both urgent and also complex. It is happening in a global economy where production is highly fragmented, supply chains stretch across borders, and working class and union power has been significantly weakened. At the same time, capital can move production and also pollution across regions with very few constraints. So the question really becomes, what is the role of working class and in this moment? How can workers and unions respond to the environmental crisis while also protecting jobs, livelihoods, and dignity? So as Honey mentioned, each speaker will talk for about 15 minutes, and I will then raise a couple of questions for both speakers, followed by a short panel discussion of about 15 to 20 minutes. And then we have an entire 1 hour devoted to questions and answers with the audience. I know 2 hours might be a little bit long, but it gives us really a good chance for a more engaged discussion. And I want to thank you all in advance for your time and patience, and particularly to thank our speakers today. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker, John Bellamy Foster, who is the editor of Monthly Review and also professor of sociology at the University of Oregon. He has written widely on political economy and has established a reputation as a major environmental sociologist. He's the author of Marx Ecology, Materialism and Nature, The Great Financial Crisis, Causes and Consequences, and The Ecological Rift, Capitalism's War on Earth, and The Theory of Monopoly Capitalism, and the elaboration of Marxian political economy, among many others. So John, you will have about 15 minutes to speak. The floor is yours.
Well, what I'm going to say may be a little bit disappointing in some ways because we're in a difficult period. I wanted to talk on the challenge of green labor and start from the United States, which of course is a country I'm most familiar with. And I'm pleased that this session is talking not just about the climate, but also ecological crisis, because it's important to understand that as big as the climate crisis is, there are 9 planetary boundaries, 7 of which we have now crossed. And there's a multitude of environmental problems, all of which, of course, are related to the climate, but cannot be reduced to the climate problems. So we need to look at the broader ecological terrain. In terms of green labor in the United States, or the the whole problem of labor in the United States, it's important to start out to recognize at the start that the only 6.8% of the workers in the private sector in the United States, which is of course the bulk of the economy, only 6.8% are unionized. And of course, there are public sector union workers that are unionized, but many of them are prohibited from striking. And ever since the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, and at the beginning of the Cold War, the labor's powers, its ability to strike, its various weapons have been trimmed away, and so that and over the years it's gotten worse. So labor has very restrictive power. There is basically a business unionism in the United States, and I think at the top of organized labor, the labor leadership generally, let's say within the AFL-CIO, is a, a labor aristocracy in the sense described by Lenin. The AFL-CIO has supported destroying unions, radical unions all over the world as part of the Cold War and now the new Cold War. So their role abroad has been reactionary, and the labor business unionism tends to restrict any kind of grassroots union movements, any attempt to radicalize the union movement, and it's quite corrupt and attached to the Democratic Party and so on. So even though there are a lot of things that are good about the unions, and I think everyone on the left supports union action. I mean, it's almost a definition of being on the left. Nonetheless, we have to recognize just how much it has been corrupted, how much it's business unionism. And if you believe in working class environmentalism, that can't simply be adherence to the unions, because most of the workers are not represented by unions. And the base of the workers' movement and the poorer workers are far more radical than the those who are at the top of the let's say labor aristocracy or labor hierarchy. So this is a problem we have. Now I wanted to mention 5 phases that have occurred, 5 phases that have developed, and maybe the possibility of a sixth and the development of green labor in the United States. The first phase, and I'm really going back to the 1980s, and it reflects my own experiences and involvement in the struggle. But the first phase can be seen as a struggle for a labor environmentalism, and really to define labor environmentalism. And the leading union in this was the oil, chemical, and atomic workers under Tony Mazzocchi, and at that time they tried to argue that the main obstacle to labor environmentalism was the job blackmail, that if there are environmental measures, environmental changes, the corporations would always say to the unions, you support this and you lose jobs. Or to individual workers, if you support this, you'll lose your job. And the job blackmail was really important. So in this period of labor environmentalism, there was a super fund that came out of the environmental movement for cleaning up pollution. The super fund that was paid out to corporations to clean up pollution, and they argued for a labor super fund that would retrain workers, ensure that they had jobs if they were thrown out of work due to environmental changes. And this was proposed and fought for and defeated. But the leading unions understood that you had to eliminate the job blackmail if they were going to be able to effectively take environmental actions. So that went on. Another phase that overlapped with this was the just transition, the argument for a just transition. Of course, that's still there, and within the labor movement from the 1970s to the 1990s particularly. And this was led by the United Steelworkers Union. In their Our Children's Future report in 1990, and their Securing Our Children's Future report in 2006, they said that global warming was the most important issue threatening workers and their children, and tried to organize around that. And it was an enormously important move. It targeted multinational corporations. And this intersected with what we could call a third phase, which was the anti-globalization movement, symbolized in the United States most by the uprising in Seattle in November 1999. And that symbolized, actually, at the time, an alliance between labor and environmentalists against globalization. But the anti-globalization movement went down to defeat in the early 2000s, I think as a result of imperialism and war that resulted in sort of collapse. I was in South Africa in 2002 for the what was called, I mean, it was the a World Conference on Sustainable Development, I think it was called, but it was supposed to be the second Earth summit, and we were we, there were unions and environmentalists were involved, and for a lot of people, it was very hopeful. I was more critical of what was going on. But while we were there, um, George W. Bush indicated that he was going to invade Iraq. And the environmental movement kind of receded in the United States in the face of war, the anti-globalization movement. The next phase was the Green New Deal. And the term Green New Deal had been around for a long time. And it was it was actually even proposed by Obama in his election, in his first election to his first term. But once he came into office, he dropped it, and it was circulating in business circles. But then it was taken up by radicals, and the Green New Deal became an organizing point. And of course, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Bernie Sanders, and others, and basically the left was behind the Green New Deal. But the Green New Deal was really a notion of a green Keynesianism, promoting the economy by promoting green jobs, putting a lot of money into the environment and producing jobs at the same time, and economic growth. And people like Robert Pollin, who I've known for a long time, he argued that that it was possible to have absolute decarbonization, not just relative decarbonization, and that there was no problem with economic growth, even in the United States, and the environment, even in a wealthy country, the United States, and the environment. And the U.S. could both expand its economy and clean up the environment. Of course, that meant reducing the environmental problem to just to the climate. And it was based on basically the fiction that countries were decarbonizing, let's say in Europe, when actually they were moving their production to the global south, and they were consuming the products of production in the global south, and it was just the way that we calculated the carbon that made it look like progress was being made. Anyway, at the time that came out, some of us on the more radical side, the Science for the People originally came out with a notion of the People's Green New Deal, and we promoted that in Month Review, emphasizing the frontline communities, emphasizing the global south as well. And then Max, of course, wrote his book on the People's Green New Deal. And that was important. It emphasized the front lines. There was a lot going on. Most unions have climate and environmental justice resolutions. The environmental justice movement had been building up in the 1980s and the 90s. And some unions, like the Service Employees International Union, which has a lot of hospital workers, have been very good on environmental struggles. Some of the Amazon worker struggles. There was an emphasis on green collar workers, and a lot of this was in the context of green Keynesianism and economic growth, and so there are parts of it that conflicted with any kind of comprehensive environmental strategy, but it was nonetheless progress. And there was even the promotion of green energy jobs, and I think my clock has stopped here, so I'm not sure about the time. But anyway, there was promotion of green energy jobs, which were increasing until about Well, they were increasing until about 2023, not counting the COVID period, and but then they've the rate of increase has declined. There was Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, which was mostly a farce, but did represent some movement in the direction of green Keynesianism. But that has all collapsed. There's no talk really of the Green New Deal anymore, or even a People's Green New Deal, which fed off of that. Not in the United States. In fact, the in the U.S., the top establishment figures like Richard Haas, who for years was head of the you know, head of U.S. in the U.S. foreign policy circles, and have declared that the end of the energy transition, the Green New Deal, was based on the energy transition to alternative energy occurring. And now they've declared last year, formally declared from the various top echelons in the United States, as well as the banks, that the energy transition is over, and the reason is because of AI. AI needs so much uh, energy and water. By 2030, it's supposed to be using up about a third of the energy in the United States, and or electricity in the United States will be devoted to AI, while about equivalent to the amount of electricity used in Japan or India. So it's just massive, and that's just the electricity. The water demands are enormous. So there's a fight that's emerging over AI that actually has now environmental aspects and is being led by labor unions, an attempt to pause AI in order to be able to regulate it and defend communities, the environment, and labor unions are very heavily involved in that. So that's really important. But the end of the energy transition is significant. It was declared over before the Trump administration came into power, because the powers that be in the United States realized that they couldn't even pretend to be pursuing an energy transition when they needed more and more fossil fuels, more and more of every form of energy, more nuclear, in order to feed the AI. And so, since the green movement, or the green labor movement, was based on there being an energy transition, it's sort of collapsed in that respect. And I think that there's a new struggle over AI that is going to be crucial. At the same time, in the United States, there's been a growth of socialism, but it's taken a very social democratic form, and uh, and the Democratic Socialists of America is diverse. Some of them are social democrats, some are revolutionary socialists, but the big publications, for example, like Jacobin, Catalyst, and now The Nation, which is edited by Bhaskar Sankara, who owns the other two. They It's taken a very anti-environmental position, adopting what they call an eco-modernist position that just says technology is the solution and to all of these problems, and attacking the environmental movement. So figures like, and part of it is on the under the flag of Marxism. So some Matt Huber, for example, has done good work in talking about workers' environmentalism, but it's all oriented towards the organized labor, not workers in general. And it goes hand in hand with attacking environmentalism, attacking degrowth, and so on, denying Matt Huber and Leigh Phillips have denied 8 of the 9 planetary boundaries. The only one they recognize is capitalism. They say that we can have infinite growth in the planet, and that Leigh Phillips argues that we can have 282 billion people on Earth or more, and which, as much as I criticize Malthusianism, I find that preposterous. And Phillips is now involved in Canada, attacking Avi Lewis and Naomi Klein and the environmental movement, trying to switch the NDP away from environmentalism and towards a workerism, which basically throws out all of the radical environmental notions. And this created a big conflict in Canada. But this is all going on. The there are social democrats arguing in favor of Marxism with the environmental movement weakened, who are allying with the capitalists, eco-modernists, the Breakthrough Institute, and so it's a big mess. And on top of this, we have imperialism and the labor aristocracy. I believe that there isn't any real way to go forward except on terms of to have a really genuine environmentalism or labor environmentalism in this day and age. It has to be planetary, it has to be global, it has to be anti-imperialist. But the same publications, especially some of the same figures like Vivek Chibber, are now denying imperialism, redefining Marxist materialism in the narrowest sense, and leaving out the environment and all the various other struggles. And so we're in a really difficult state with a lot of the left going to the right, and with a neo-fascist state under MAGA and Trump, and which is also an eco-fascist state, we can say nowadays. I believe that the only answer is an anti-imperialist one, a global environmentalism. I talk in terms of the environmental proletariat, but I'm sure I'm way out of time now. So I'll
Yes.
answer
Thank
questions
you.
about that if they come up.
Great.
But we do need a workers' movement, but we need to reconstitute it if we're going to have a movement that's a workers' movement that's an environmental movement out of absolute necessity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John, for sharing your insights and for laying out the stages of environmental movement in the United States and clarifying its relations with the labor movement and also showing its underlying structural tensions. I really look forward to raising some questions later. Let me now turn to our second speaker, Max Ale, whose work brings these questions into the context of imperialism and the global South. A brief introduction first. Max Ale is a senior fellow at University of Ghent and an associated researcher at Tunisian Observatory for Food Sovereignty and the Environment. He is an associate editor at Agrarian South and Journal of Labor and Society, and has written for the Journal of Peasant Studies and the Review of African Political Economy. His book, A People's Green New Deal, was published in 2021 with Pluto Press. Max, please.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for the guests for taking some time out of your afternoon or evening. I'm actually going to, which I used to never do a PowerPoint. So I will share it and talk over it or through it. It should be visible now, I believe. Sufficiently visible. In fact, I think it can be useful to orient our discussion about green transition by thinking about where, in fact, we want to go, and then thinking about how to get there, which is maybe disarmingly obvious or might seem trite or even silly, but I find it serves as a useful orienting pole for conversations where there are often presumptions in our work about convergences, about what we think about the world, rather than articulated stances about what we want to see and how to get there. And if we articulate them, then we can understand maybe where we see things differently, and then we can then think about how we can possibly converge to get to different places. And so this is a classic thing from the dialogue from Alice in Wonderland, that it really depends which way you want to go, depends on where you want to get to, right? Um, so I'm going to start there. And what is eco-socialism? That is, what is the world overall we would like to see? And it's very loose, of course, but it's a very general schematic. It's a worldwide decommodification, that is the social control over the means of production, more or less permanently sustainable patterns of production, um, worldwide developmental convergence, that is, the whole world should have the same levels of development, um, equal per capita access to energy, that is, worldwide developmental convergence rests on more or less equal access to energy, which is something very fundamental, and equal labor distribution. Right now, the third world tends to work a lot harder than the first, and the first world tends to have a much higher level of consumption than the third. That is not a just world system, and it's also a world system that's maintained by a great deal of violence. So what is the nature of our world? And again, we have very differing assumptions and analyses about what that is, which I think John was pointing to. And I would say that there's a lot of arguments internal to we can say the different camps, but there's two basic frameworks that I think are dominant. One proposal, which is associated with some but not other schools of Marxism in the West, claims that development basically is not polarized, that capitalism is basically flat, is more or less the same everywhere, or moving in the direction of being same everywhere, and tends to have a secular tendency towards worldwide polarization. A second proposal claims that development has always been, and capitalism has always been, inherently polarized from when it became a worldwide system. And so this is just a graphic of unemployment rates. And I think it takes a lot of arguing or argument or strained argumentation to actually claim that development is not polarized and polarizing. That is, it's a conclusion one can draw if one looks at most sets of aggregate data. Now,
Max, sorry to interrupt. Are you able to full screen the slides if it's okay?
I can try. Yeah, 1 second. Let me unshare full screen and okay. Visible?
Yes, yes. Thank you so much.
Okay, no problem. I understand the issue. I'm not that technologically adept. So this is a schematic account of the people who claim that flat capitalism, that is, capitalism is kind of iterative, that it's the same, that they argue basically that the northern industrial proletariat should be the leading class, right? Which is then an idea that's sold in the North, and that will lead to eco-socialism. And then the argument about polarized capitalism is that the semi-proletariat, that is peasants, peripheral industrial labor, third world working class women, third world women who are outside the formal labor force, would be the leading class. This is based on the theory of the weak link from Lenin. And this puts national liberation, that is the national control over the freedom of development of the productive forces, at the center of our analysis, and that this is a path to eco-socialism. Social science, or the history of the world over the last century, has made very clear that it has been in the zone, what Samir and Amin like to call the zone of storms, in which the more radical struggles in our world system occurred. And it's more or less the first world working class has not been very successful in fighting for an egalitarian world system. I mean, this is more or less an empirical truth. It's a hypothesis that's been proven by history. And if we want to change that history, we have to acknowledge the history as it happened. So, also, I mean, to talk about modern imperialism, it's basically the stage of late monopoly capitalism. And it's also important to understand that imperialism is not a question of economics and accounting. It's a sociological phenomenon. That's a phenomenon that envelops the entirety of the world system. And it's based, of course, on value flows that go from north to south, that is, claims on resources, claims on labor. But it's neither is it reducible to trade, nor is it reducible merely to profit. That is, imperialism also rests on the destruction of productive infrastructure. This is very important to keep in mind because this is what we see in Palestine, Yemen, Syria, Iran, Venezuela. We see the raising of productive infrastructure as integral to the process of accumulation on a world scale. That is, there is the process of political engineering, the process of the destruction of sovereign third world states, this process of the destruction of national liberation movements is part and parcel of making sure that value can continue to flow from the south to the north. The specifically ecological face of imperialism basically is about unequal access to rents, unequal access to clean environments, and the under reproduction of peripheral life. That is, people in the third world living worse lives, comparatively speaking, in relation to the quality of their environments than people in the north. And again, this is very well documented, and we see it in a myriad of ways. There's a greater exposure to natural disasters, worse and worse under global warming. There's a greater exposure to environmental toxins, pesticides, industrial waste. We know about how the EU is exporting garbage to Turkey, how the EU exports pesticides or uses pesticides that are no longer legal in the EU and uses them in North Africa. We also know how the third world workforce that migrates to the north, for example, that works in northern agribusiness, which tend to be undocumented Chicano workers, for example, are overexposed to illegal pesticides. The third world is also much more exposed to deforestation with concomitant health effects, and overall is having worse health outcomes as a result. That is, because of the price system, the commodities people in the third world produce are not remunerated, are not paid at a cost sufficient to allow for the production of the environment. Right. And this then leads to worsening health outcomes. And this is part of imperialism. And this is how what we call ecologically unequal exchange, which actually refers to an umbrella of phenomena, right, manifests at the level of the environment and at the level of what Marxists call value. Now, just specifically, there's also other forms of ecological devastation that are intimately linked to imperialism. One, at the level of production, there's a massive diversion of the physical productive base, north and south, to armaments, which is a diverted surplus. That is, instead of the surplus going towards basic needs or going to things that basically expand worldwide lifespan, for example, increase free time and so forth, they go towards the production of weapons, which is a form of waste that is imposed on the South by the North, right? Potentially, it's also a point of convergence between first and third world labor if first world labor is willing to destroy the military industrial plant. Right. Second of all, we see the ecological devastation of imperialism in the destruction of the ecology in Palestine, Syria, Iraq, very vividly, the recent destruction of oil depots in Iran, which led to oil flowing through the sewer system of Iran, then going on fire. And these are having ecological consequences, which will be registered for decades, right? And then finally, the denial of a planning capacity. That is, for example, the process of war that is imposed on the third world can actually rip apart ecological planning capacity. Very vividly, this occurred, for example, in the remediation programs that were put in place during the production of the Aswan Dam in Egypt. There were plans for soil remediation. They could not be implemented because of resource diversion that occurred because of the US-Israeli 1967 war inflicted on the people of Egypt and elsewhere. Or we can look at the very underread and critically important work of Danny Faber on the Sandinista revolution, where there was actually an ecological revolution alongside the social revolution in the 1980s. And in fact, very directly, you saw the diversion of cadres from there to the task of national self-defense, right? And this process of undermining of people's or revolutionary movements' ability to do ecological planning occurred through the process of US-sponsored counterinsurgency itself, right? You see this on perhaps a lesser scale through the destruction of seed banks, Qarda in Syria, for example, right? As a result of the US proxy war persecuted against this country, most vividly since 2011, although Black Ops started before then. That is, we cannot separate between the ecology and imperialism, and we cannot separate between the ecological question and imperialism. So this brings us to a few organizing categories that I think are helpful, especially to the extent that this audience is in the North, which I think it is. It reminds us that national liberation is both a mental, ideological, and also political organizing category. That is, the sovereignty regime, which is one way of talking about the interstate system, is a prerequisite for organizing any discussion about eco-socialist transition and is a prerequisite for an eco-socialist transition. It's a very simple point, but it is unrealistic to expect that countries are going to put in place and converge on ecological planning policies in a North-South dialogue if there's not national sovereignty in those states. That is, you need the container of a safe and secure state, which is also a working class interest in general. It's a working class interest not to be bombed, in order to carry out an eco-socialist transition and in order for people in the South and people in the North to converge on an ecological program. That is, you cannot have a North-South dialogue when the North is bombing the South. So what does the Southern face of this struggle look like, a struggle for eco-socialism? It looks like ecologically modulated or ecologically aware sovereign industrialization, right? That is, the development of the necessary machine tools to be able to produce what is needed for both either nationally or probably regionally. It rests on agrarian reform, that is breaking up the large estates and also putting in place relatively more agroecological forms of production. The most famous example of this is Zimbabwe, which is subjected to asphyxiating sanctions. Right. It's also of note that more recently Zimbabwe has moved to a lot of ecological forms of ecological and climate kind of smart forms of farming on the farms that have been the beneficiary of the agrarian reform, which broke the back of the white settler agrarian structure. All of this, of course, is part of national liberation, that is freeing the development of the national productive forces. And it is, of course, part of delinking, which is setting in motion a process of subjecting all of the external relations, external economic and political relations, to an internal logic based on popular will and popular needs, including the fulfillment of basic needs. In the North, of course, there are also things to do. There's still a need for the decommodification of all necessary services, improvements in the quality and ecological lightening of all of forms of production, from health, infrastructure, consumer goods, to agriculture and energy. And I wrote about this a lot in my book. The technologies more or less exist. They need development, but a lot of them exist. And of course, if social resources were actually devoted to the research into the necessary technologies, then obviously you can have a better quality of life and you can have relatively less labor devoted to the realm of necessity. But overall, there are even the currently existing technologies are sufficient for a very high quality of life north and south. The problems are political. The northern face of the struggle, however, also has to include anti-imperialism, which consistently disappears from northern ecological discourse. Um, and it also includes demilitarization because the North does not face self-defense needs, the South does, and the repayment of the climate debt, which means reparations, knowledge transfers, technology transfers, and so forth. And there is, I think Greta Thunberg put this very well. It's a system talking about the Northern capitalism. It's a system defined by colonialism, imperialism, oppression, and genocide. And this is something we need to keep in mind when we think about ecological transition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Max. So I think both speakers raised some really important issues, and there are some overlaps also between what the two speakers are trying to emphasize here. So I'm going to just follow up with some questions to both speakers, and we're going to have a quick panel discussion before we open the floor to the audience here. So I'm gonna first raise the question to John. I think John, in your books and also in the talk just now, you discussed this conflict between workers and environment in general, and especially in the global South, where sometimes the only available jobs are often provided just by capitalists and are often carbon intensive and ecologically damaging by nature. You call it labor blackmailing, right? You mentioned several terms to describe this kind of dilemma and conflict. And you mentioned that sometimes environmental and labor activists can appear to have a conflict of interest. There seems to be a similar debate in the global North as well, where workers in the traditional fossil fuel sectors are worried about losing their jobs and pensions when green transitioning is happening, when worried about them not having sufficient skills to transition into the new industries. And so there were a lot of resistance also based on that reasonable concerns. So how can we make sense of this dilemma? I know you talked a lot in your talk just now, but can you elaborate a little bit more on that, especially from the perspective of both the global South and also the global North working class, in terms of the possibility or the impossibility of reconcile this tension? And I think there are also there was an audience, I think, in the chat room mentioning about a point that you just touched on in your talk about labor aristocracy. And there are a lot of saying about how labor aristocracy is no longer a relevant concept. Do you want to also maybe comment a little bit on that? Thank you.
Well, I don't know how one could say labor aristocracy isn't a relevant concept. It's more relevant now than it probably ever has been, and because as Max said, you know, the conditions of workers are in the North are much better. The and they're, but not all workers. I mean, it's very divided. Like there's just statistics that came out in Canada the other day that said the 1% at the top in Canada own more than 80% at the bottom. And it's similar in the United States, but you know, the labor aristocracy, the way I look at it is in Lenin's terms, which it doesn't apply to all labor. It applies to privileged workers, and often these conservative unions, the labor leaders, are really part of the system, and they've supported the Cold War and the new Cold War, and have been actually opposed to workers organizing in many respects, against grassroots workers organizing. So you have a split in the working class. On one hand, the real wages for workers in the United States are back where they were in the 1970s. They haven't increased for 50 years. On the other hand, you still have this, really pretty corrupt business unionism at the top. And that certainly is a labor aristocracy. The mistake is to apply it to the whole working workforce. And Lenin said that in face of the labor aristocracy, you have to go deeper. You have to go into you have to approach the mass of the workers, as opposed to the labor aristocrats. And then when you look at this situation globally, of course, we can't ignore the fact that the the AFL-CIO is not protesting. I mean, it said that it says that the war on Iran deviates from that international law, but what they say can barely be considered a protest against the war. It stays within Democratic Party channels. If you're, and in these circumstances, you can't pretend that the top of the labor movement in the United States isn't the kind of labor aristocracy tied into imperialism. So it's just a reality we have to deal with. And Engels first introduced the labor aristocracy issue to explain why workers in England in his day weren't more revolutionary. And he said, well, there's a spectrum of the workers that are gaining from colonialism and from the British hegemony, and this is the kind of situation we find. In terms of the other part of the question, it's really a great contradiction when you look at the global South. You look at in the Congo, the workers are digging cobalt with picks and shovels, and the benefits are going to multinational corporations, but they're breathing in the cobalt dust. They're getting it on their skin. They're dying from this. It's enforced by military, interventions in the Congo, perpetual warfare being generated by the global North. And the cobalt is being then used in the high tech in the North. And we're saying, the answer is to bring in alternative energy, solar, wind, all of these things, all of our technological devices, but they need cobalt, and we're exploiting workers in the Congo who have no alternative. They have no other place that they can work, no other way of surviving. So an environmentalism that ignores, that says, oh, well, we'll just go for alternative energy, and ignores what's happening in the global South. Look at the lithium mines. Look at at Bolivia and lithium. We basically we basically engineered a coup in Bolivia to get hold of the lithium. That is, the United States, Washington did. And for every ton of lithium, you need some god awful amount of I think it's like 2 million liters of water. And this is like bringing down the water table. It's taking the water populations need. We have to understand that even, that you can't, as Max said, you can't really have an environmental policy in the North that says, well, alternative energy is the solution, without recognizing that a lot of this is based on the super exploitation of the global South, the ecological expropriation of resources there. And, in terms of the North, yeah, it's the job blackmail is very big, and the unions haven't fought this severely enough. The they're the the unions, the big unions in the United States, the AFL-CIO, is embroiled in Trump's um, whole notion of digging oil, perpetually. What is it? He forgot the phrase yesterday, and now I'm confused. But dig, baby, dig, or something like that. But the whole notion of like building up the fossil fuel industry, the unions are behind that, despite the environmental consequences, and going against it means that they run into the job blackmail. That's why I talk about the environmental proletariat. I mean, I think our hope lies in basically material conditions are deteriorating across the board, and people are going to learn what materialism means again. They already know it in the global South, and they're increasingly going to learn in the global North. But we talk about the working class movement as though it's only involved with jobs and factory jobs, and that's all they're concerned with, wages and blue collar industry and so on. And the truth is that the working class, insofar it is a class, is concerned with the entire nature of life, and with their urban conditions, their housing, the access to food and water and basic necessities and so on. And this is becoming an issue everywhere. And the environment, materialism in terms of the environment, and materialism in terms of the economy are kind of merging. If people don't have food, they don't say, well, is this because of the economy or is this because of the environment? The two merge together. It's usually both. And we're increasingly going to see a struggle of working people, working class people, the environmental proletariat, so to speak, that is forced to deal with these issues simultaneously. They can no longer be boxed off from each other. And that's when you really get revolutionary movements. And you're already seeing that all over the global South. The global North is going to increasingly learn this too. So the narrow spectrum of labor union activity, as it's defined today, can't really sustain that, and it will have to broaden or cease to exist. It will have to respond to the needs of working people everywhere, or or it will become dysfunctional, useless, and will not help us out of this global ecological crisis.
Thank you so much, John, for clarifying your point, and for providing more details on some of the points that you made in the talk. So I'm going to now switch to Max. And Max, the question for you, I think you laid out very clearly in your talk just now, and also in your book, that a program based on universal access to renewable energy, climate debt repayments, and decommodify public goods would fundamentally disrupt existing systems of production, which is capitalism and imperialism. And you also made an important, to my mind, very important point about how a prerequisite to eco-socialism is for the global South countries to have national sovereignty. And so I wonder, and I know you discuss basically your take on what the global North should be doing and what the global South should be doing. And you also talked about the difference between a flat capitalism and a polarized capitalism in terms of their take on which working class would be the leading class for revolutionary changes. I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit more on how should we think about the role of workers and trade unions in this kind of transition? And in particular, how can labor movement engage with a project that may be deeply transformative and potentially disruptive to existing jobs and industries? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very important question, and I think it depends on the labor union at a certain level, and because labor unions are strategically and ecologically inserted in global production in different ways. To take the extreme example, workers' control of Lockheed Martin is not something I'm interested in, right? And it would be foolhardy to expect the workers in Lockheed Martin to overthrow their own firm or to carry out like a Lucas plan, which was a plan for the kind of conversion of ecologically destructive to production to kind of worker-controlled, ecologically sustainable production. It was never implemented. So it depends, right? We really have to think about it depends. I mean, and I think that it's unfortunately there is because of the metabolic rift, there's very often a fundamental alienation between the process of, say, industrial production and the ecological consequences of industrial production. And secondly, even where there's not, it is often extremely difficult to balance the needs of the sectoral needs of unions with the kind of more general need, even of a municipal, let alone national working class. Again, I'll take an example I know, which is Tunis and Gabes, where there has been a catastrophe associated with the phosphate plants. At a certain level, there's been a catastrophe. That is, in the neighborhoods adjoining the phosphate plant, and Gabes is a maritime oasis in southern Tunisia. In the neighborhoods adjoining the phosphate plant, you have rates of cancer 10 times the expected rates of kidney cancer and liver failure, liver cancer. You have problems with bone density, bones that break and don't heal. And more recently, you have kind of toxic chemical fumes coming directly from the plants, and people are actually literally choking. Now, traditionally, or in the history of environmental mobilization, it was actually totally separated from the working class. More recently, there's kind of a more wide-ranging movement that has included some sector of the actual working class that's working in that phosphate plant itself. And at least one of the demands, anyway, it wasn't implemented, so it doesn't matter that much, was to just get rid of the phosphate manufacturing plants. If the phosphate manufacturing plants in Tunisia were just removed, right, in the current situation, the country would be in an economic depression, right? The overall people would suffer a huge amount economically. The country would lack the hard currency. It would spiral into an out of control economic situation, right? So I think it's just an example of the difficulty of the great difficulty of and because I don't want to give an answer to a false answer. I want to rather I think it's more useful to kind of provoke some questions that I think are helpful for people to work through in concrete situations. I don't think this question of what unions can do is generalizable, and I don't think it's straightforward, and I don't think it's necessarily easy. And I don't think it can actually be derived really from at the level of theory, right? I think it has to be derived from a concrete practice. And I think unions need to be engaged in a political struggle also, right? That is to take the Tunisian example, right? There is a possibility of getting rid of the phosphate installations or modernizing them, either way, so that they deal appropriately with their ecological waste. In If you are forcing the political system to invest in their modernization and dealing with the waste, or of a form of an overall economic planning system, a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan, a series of 5-year plans that are shifting the overall country's system of production, right? Um, if you aren't, and what I think that one can generalize from that case, right, is that extremely often the problem is that ecology and short-term economic interest are setting workers against other workers, or workers in the industrial sector against other workers, um, as they apprehend or understand their interests on an immediate basis. And there is a lack of a party as articulator, right? To some, to be very old school, to some, the general interest of the working class, or articulate a general interest of the working class that can help people see beyond these short-term horizons that are totally rational, right? It would be very stupid to say people are being stupid. In fact, people are making very rational decisions, like they don't want their kids to starve, and someone else doesn't want their kid to be infected with cancer, to be afflicted with cancer. These are real issues that have to be dealt with at the level of a political organization and plan and proposal that can transcend these interests that are sectoral and partial in the interest of a broader synthesis. And I think this is something we have to think about when if we are doing organizing or education or so forth, to say that the union struggle can't really be separated from the broader political struggle, right? Even though at any given moment, of course, unions could have determinant roles to play in terms of pushing for transitions towards renewables on the one hand, or at the political level, like our comrades in Italy have done a fairly good job at carrying out either general strikes or refusing to load weapons to Israel or Saudi Arabia, for example, right? So there are concrete things to do for unions based on how they are inserted in the overall system of production and the overall pollution-causing system. But um, I think that it's very important that we keep in mind the overall political framework, and we keep in mind the overall political framework that offers a possible North-South convergence, because a lot of the union discussion, unfortunately, in the North, or the people propagandizing to or about or ventriloquizing unions, is often based on sidestepping the North-South contradiction. And we need to find ways to move beyond that, which also means popular education, right? Maybe people don't know about these things. And that's something that is very important also. So those are kind of some general problematics. I don't want to talk beyond my knowledge or expertise and go beyond that, really.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the very thoughtful answer, Max. I keep thinking that when I was discussing with my colleagues and also my students, I realize a lot of the debates and arguments are about climate change among the left, actually, are resulting from making arguments on different levels. I mean, sometimes we're arguing from the theoretical perspective, sometimes we're arguing from the policy perspective, sometimes from the organizing perspective. And it seems like if we are engaging discussion from different perspectives, sometimes it would lead to different conclusions. On the theoretical level, I think a lot of us in this room would agree that radical changes are necessary. But on the policy level, sometimes, even the insufficient policies like Green New Deal probably is still better than retreating from the Paris Agreement, for instance. And on the organizing level, like you said, it really depends on the concrete situation you're involved in. Are we talking about global north or south? Are we talking about workers in the fossil fuel industry or in the renewable sector in the north? Or are we talking about like people like John was mentioning, I have no other choice except working in extractive industries, right? So I think these are all very, very concrete and realistic concerns that we need to address case by case.